My introduction to Marilynne Robinson's fiction came in 2011, when my mother gave me a copy of Gilead, Robinson's second novel, as a gift for Christmas. My mother, who studied literature during her college years in Boston and then later taught English for a time, has always had very similar taste in books to my own. When I began reading the Robinson, I immediately recognized why she had foreseen that I would, as a young philosophy graduate student, find the work's vision of life so engrossing. After finishing it, I then next read Home, the sequel to Gilead, published in 2008, a work that I, like so many others, found poignant for the inimitable ambivalence of its deeply theological vision of life that was at once as hopeful as it is melancholic and as consoling as it is unsettling. Thus, when in November of 2014, Robinson came to Oxford Sheldonian Theatre for the launch of Lila, the third work in her Gilead series, I naturally was in attendance amid a packed house of hundreds, eager to hear the author speak directly about the novels that had given us all so much to think. After reading a selection from Lila, followed by a conversation between her and the moderator, Robinson took audience questions. I distinctly recall being so nervous that I was unsure whether I would be able to bring myself to ask one. Before I knew it, however, to my surprise, I found my hand raised, and before I could retract it on second thought, the moderator had already called on me. The question I had been wondering about as I listened that evening was the same one that initially intrigued me when reading her novels, and which I assumed many of her readers there that night must have had in mind also. Why, so I asked, of all the many atheists from the history of philosophy whom Robinson could have made the foil for the Congregationalist Reverend John Ames, had she chosen Ludwig Feuerbach? Gilead's is Ames' own answer. The novel is a series of letters reminiscent of Augustine's Confessions. Quote, "An experiment with candor," is how Ames himself characterizes the purpose of his letters, which the 76-year-old Ames writes in 1957 to his young son Robbie to read later in life, is that it's Feuerbach who, despite his atheism, is, quote, "about as good on the joyful aspects of religion as anyone," end quote. And thus, it's the 19th century German philosopher's magnum opus, The Essence of Christianity, that presents the strongest challenge to the religious life, insofar as it falls to the Christian, like Ames, in turn to account for what exactly, if anything, Feuerbach's vision of life gets wrong, or crucially misses, or else distorts by rejecting Christianity. In the back of my mind, when asking this question, of course, was an implicit but not for that unobvious corollary one. Why not have chosen the role assigned Feuerbach instead Nietzsche, for example, the self-professed enemy of all that is Christian, who not only famously in The Gay Science announces the death of God, but who, more than anyone, Feuerbach included, offers an atheistic vision of life affirmation inspired specifically through its express inversion of everything it takes to be life-denying about Christianity. As noted in Ryan Kemp and Jordan Rogers' Marilynne Robinson's Worldly Gospel, a text that will serve as a touchstone when examining Robinson's work in what is to follow, quote, Marilynne Robinson never explicitly refers to Friedrich Nietzsche in her novels, and she only very rarely mentions him in her essayistic work, end quote. Probably because of the nerves, for the life of me, I cannot remember what Robinson's answer was to my question. Fortunately, Kemp and Rogers' text interrogates and answers these two very questions, thereby illuminating and deepening our understanding of what accounts for why Robinson's literary vision deservingly commands the near universal admiration it does. And like the novels it analyzes, Marilynne Robinson's Worldly Gospel is a wonderful book and joy to read. In what follows then, I should simply like to offer some thoughts in response to its perceptive analysis of Gilead. My remarks will be informed by the other three Gilead novels as well, even if they will not be mentioned explicitly as frequently, with an eye to the claim, consistent with Kemp and Rogers' own, that Robinson's fiction is in some important sense distinctively philosophical, that we might go so far as to speak justifiably of Robinson's phenomenology. That is to say, not that phenomenology can contribute to reading Robinson, but rather that Robinson contributes to phenomenology itself in a manner only literature can. Robinson's fiction, the 4 Gilead novels, Gilead, Home, Lila, and Jack, and her first novel, Housekeeping also, are philosophical literature because they are phenomenological, and precisely so, insofar as they return us to the things themselves, by showing and describing, among other things, but above all, the beauty of creation. An examination of Robinson, in turn, will invite consideration of a broader set of reflections concerning the relation between fiction and philosophy, the nature of philosophical literature, and philosophical literature's relation to theology. We shall in due course turn to Faulkner also, paying specific attention to his novel Light in August, whose literary vision of the world, despite itself being phenomenological, is very different from Robinson's own. This raises the question of which competing vision of the world, Robinson's or Faulkner's, is the more truthful, and what indeed the phenomenon of truthfulness amounts to in literature. I should hasten to emphasize that I'm not intending to say that all literature that is philosophical in the way Faulkner's and Robinson's fiction is philosophical. The point instead is to clarify how philosophical literature of this kind is philosophical insofar as it's phenomenological, and how it's phenomenological, furthermore, in a way that naturally and inevitably opens unto a theological horizon. The works of Robinson and Faulkner are, to borrow a turn of phrase from a recent book title of Robert Pippin's, quote, literature as philosophy by other means, end quote. In any case, as shall become clear by discussion's end, the answer to Feuerbach or Nietzsche will not consist in having offered traditional theological proofs for God's mere existence. Through creative attention to her Gilead characters, Robinson describes the everyday life of being before God so as to make God's presence manifest to those who reflect carefully on what she shows. For Ames, and in this respect Robinson herself, the mystery of beauty reveals God's presence in human affairs and his providential hand over the life of men. In the eyes of Ames, the mystery of God is visible everywhere, even in the little old, quote, backwater of Gilead, Iowa. We consequently encounter descriptions of beauty's myriad forms throughout Ames's reflections. There's the beauty of, quote, watching people laugh, the beauty of, quote, eating standing there at the stoop in the chill in the dark, the beauty of Ames's grandfather's Kansas sun-scorched gravesite with the moon, quote, standing on its edge, the beauty of, quote, luminous water pouring down on a young man and woman out for a walk, the beauty of the, quote, way the light fell on the porch while watching Robbie play in the yard with the family cat Soapy, the beauty of the good childhood years shared by the brothers and sisters at his friend Boughton's home, the beauty of Robbie's, quote, solemn face lifted up to receive communion at Ames's hand, the beauty of the way his mother used to rub the laundry white and clean on the washboard, the beauty of his wife Lila's face the first time he saw her that afternoon she came to his church to escape the rain, the beauty of the flowers and flames on needlework hanging on the wall of the church's communion table, the beauty of Jack Boughton and Robbie playing catch, quote, in the flickering shade, the beauty of the women's voices singing at the ashen side of a burned-down black church, the beauty of the memory of Boughton's late wife and children playing in the, quote, gardens with their cats and kites and bubbles, the beauty of the fifth commandment, to honor thy parents, the beauty of the, quote, other lives of those in Gilead during Ames's own years of loneliness after the death of his first wife and child, the beauty of the, quote, images in his mind of Lila, the beauty of the, quote, sun shining with the, quote, cicadas chanting and the, quote, willows straggling their tresses in the water, the beauty of someone else's, quote, virtue or happiness, the beauty of the love poems from the Song of Songs, the beauty of Robbie's, quote, very bright friend Tobias, the beauty, quote, in the listless and troubled Jack Boughton, the beauty of the words from Numbers with which Ames blesses Jack, the beauty of Robbie's bright eyes and pink and cold fingers, the beauty of the joy there would have been had Boughton known that Ames had blessed Jack, and finally, more generally, the beauty of creation, which, as Ames says, quote, is more than our eyes can bear, end quote. From beginning to end, Ames's letters scarcely go a page without invoking the beauty of some person, place, or thing. And this list of beauty's profusions could be multiplied if we take note also of all the other beautiful phenomena to which he draws our attention by other names, such as what is said to be radiant, wonderful, lovely, amazing, happy, remarkable, miraculous, or simply good. This phrase, quote, more than our eyes can bear, used to describe our experience of beauty's manifestation, is bound to call to mind in Robinson's philosophical readers Jean-Luc Marignon's phenomenology of givenness, which turns crucially on its formulation of what Marion has termed the, quote, saturated phenomenon. In Ames's descriptions of the revelation of beautiful things, there frequently is expressed astonishment in response to their excess, surplus, or indeed saturation. As Ames observes, when people use the term, quote, just, in order to underscore the splendor of something's sheer existence, they call attention to its, quote, existing in excess of itself, so to speak, a sort of purity or lavishness, at any rate, something ordinary in kind, but exceptional in degree, end quote. As he says elsewhere, such revelation, this, quote, excess or, quote, lavishness, Marion would say bedazzlement, strikes us as, quote, blindingly beautiful. Ames, however, does not restrict his reflection on beauty's mysterious excess to the individual things of the world, but instead articulates a vision of beauty that encompasses the world as a whole. This ecstatic vision of the creation culminates in the most memorable passage from Gilead, the, quote, Troy passage, one Kemp and Rogers quote in its entirety thrice, and in part a number of additional times as well. In his most definitive statement of how, in his view, this present world's beauty is suffused with the presence of God, pointing to what lies in store in the eschaton, Ames writes, quote, I feel sometimes as if I were a child who opens its eyes on the world once and sees amazing things it will never know any names for, and then has to close its eyes again. I know this all mere apparition is compared to what awaits us, but it's only lovelier for that. There's a human beauty in it. And I can't believe that when we've all been changed and put on incorruptibility, we will forget our fantastic condition of mortality and impermanence, the great bright dream of procreating and perishing that meant the whole world to us. In eternity, this world will be Troy, I believe, and all that has passed here will be the epic of the universe, the ballad they sing in the streets. Because I don't imagine that any reality putting this one in the shade entirely, and I think piety forbids me to try, end quote. While the passage is biblical language, in particular, its talk of how we will have all, quote, been changed and, quote, put on incorruptibility, is drawn directly from chapter 15 of St. Paul's first letter to the Corinthians on the resurrection. The deeper biblical locus classicus for Ames's vision surely resides elsewhere, namely in chapter 1 of St. Paul's letter to the Romans. Significantly, and what is the only explicit reference to Romans in Gilead, Ames says, quote, right perception is right worship. See especially Romans 1, end quote. This observation about the relation between perception and worship underlies the spiritual vision at work in the earlier Troy passage. Although the glorified state Ames imagines in his saturated vision of this present world's beauty derives its theological support from 1 Corinthians, the very basis of that eschatological hope, insofar as it's a hope ultimately grounded in what he sees, lies unmistakably in Romans. For it's there, in chapter 1, that St. Paul states that God is known through the visible things that are seen, Romans 1:20. The declaration, in fact, is more so an observation or report, inasmuch as the entire thrust of his contention that such a statement is itself based on what anyone, not just the apostle, can see for oneself. Indeed, this is precisely why he punctuates the point by remarking that those who don't see, or claim not to see, are, quote, without excuse, Romans 1:20. The reason those who are blind to God's creation, which is to say, blind to the fact that the world is God's creation, Ames himself highlights when explaining to Robbie the heart of his disagreement with Feuerbach. The problem, says Ames, is idolatry. Quote, God is set apart. He's one. He's not to be imagined as a thing among other things. Idolatry. This is what Feuerbach failed to grasp. End quote. According to Ames, right perception entails right worship because seeing things aright first demands a willingness to acknowledge the Creator through creation. St. Paul expresses the matter by saying that those who don't see have blinded themselves, having failed to worship properly by neither, quote, glorifying God nor being, quote, thankful, Romans 1:21. The same point, it should be said, is made by Dostoevsky's Zosima in The Brothers Karamazov. It should be noted here before proceeding further that Robinson's Ames rejects natural theology as it's conceived of in Aquinas' 5 ways, or as the kind of discursive argumentation that one finds in much of the contemporary analytic philosophy of religion. But if one understands natural theology in a, quote, expanded sense, as Kevin Hart understands it in Lands of Likeness, then Robinson's fiction's phenomenological approach to God might be understood as a kind of natural theology insofar as it marshals, by way of description and not argument, what is manifest of the divine without recourse to so-called special revelation, that is to say, Scripture or any doctrine promulgated by an ecclesial body. In other places in his letters, Ames will opine to Robbie on the futility of engaging in debates over God's existence. Quote, nothing true, he writes, can be said about God from a posture of defense, end quote. Or again, quote, in the matter of belief, I've always found that defenses have the same irrelevance about them as the criticisms they're meant to answer. I think the attempt to defend belief can unsettle it, in fact, because there's always an inadequacy in argument about ultimate things, end quote. Or finally, quote, so my advice is this, don't look for proofs. Don't bother with them at all. They're never sufficient to the question, and they're always a little impertinent, I think, because they claim for God a place within our conceptual grasp, end quote. Ames does not, in this fashion, only place himself in the good company of Christian existentialists such as Pascal, Kierkegaard, and Dostoevsky, who believe that it's both foolish and counterproductive to bother with the traditional proofs of God contained in natural theology or metaphysics. His view about God's transcending our conceptual powers of comprehension again inevitably calls to mind Marilynne, where before the saturated phenomenon had proved a useful point of reference for appreciating Ames's notion of excess, here it's Marilynne's critique of atheism's conceptual idolatry that is illuminating. In Negative Certainties, for example, Marilynne outlines what in response to Nietzsche's madman he terms the, quote, death of God. The modern mantra of the death of God, as he notes, merely concerns a concept of God. Anything that the atheist would claim to negate in thought cannot thereby be God. Any concept at issue in such a negation is but an idol of the God it represents, God himself always transcending whatever idea we purport to possess of him. Notwithstanding what one makes of the lessons Marilynne believes negative theology has to teach us, Ames's own criticism of what he means by idolatry isn't so oblique. At bottom, he, and presumably Robinson also, views rationalistic arguments over God's existence as ineffectual and empty practically, because they neglect the fact that Christianity ultimately is not supposed just to be a doctrine, but a way of life. Thus, for Ames, popular modern atheistic arguments against God are neither here nor there. Responding to such atheism with theistic counterarguments in kind, as he learned from witnessing his elder brother Edward's own intellectual embrace of atheism, would be a futile endeavor. Quote, it seems to me some people just go around looking to get their faith unsettled. That's been the fashion for the last 100 years or so. My brother Edward gave his book to me, The Essence of Christianity, thinking to shock me out of my uncritical piety, end quote. Edward, who studied philosophy at the University City of Göttingen, came home from Germany to small-town Iowa an atheist, quote, with a walking stick and a huge mustache, Herr Doctor, end quote. Ames's rejection of traditional proofs for God's existence in turn explains his means of handling Romans chapter 1. Whereas many theologians have interpreted it as an exercise in natural theology, in particular as proffering a cosmological or causal argument for God's existence, Ames correctly reads the passage in its self-intended phenomenological register. St. Paul is not offering us any argument for God's existence, but drawing our attention to the experiential fact that we are able to perceive God for ourselves through creation, assuming we're willing. Of course, the atheist will in turn reply by dismissing Ames's vision of creation as an illusion. He is aware of the objection when he writes of what he terms its two, quote, insidious notions, namely that, quote, religion and religious experience are illusions of some sort, Feuerbach, Freud, etc., and the other is that religion itself is real, but your belief that you participate in it is an illusion. I think the second of these is the more insidious because it's religious experience above all that authenticates religion for the purposes of the individual believer, end quote. To say that something is an illusion in the technical Freudian sense, rather than the more colloquial one, is not to claim that it's a false belief per se. It's to say, rather, that it's a belief formed on something besides the evidence and without an eye to truth. It's a matter of wish fulfillment, a fantasy, a belief held because it's comforting rather than true. As Kemp and Rogers say, quote, many use Christianity for purely consolatory purposes, more or less as a kind of refined painkiller, a promise of serene afterlife that makes the pervasive suffering and disappointment of the present more endurable, end quote. Religious belief in this respect might be considered life-denying as Nietzsche understands it. Of course, Freud himself, like Feuerbach and Nietzsche, does believe that Christian belief is false. Freud's theory of wish fulfillment, like Nietzsche's account of ressentiment, is meant to explain why someone would choose to believe a falsehood. Insofar as it's a falsifying image of reality, it allows the believer under its spell not to have to face the ugly truths of life. Rather than affirming life, amor fati, as Nietzsche says, the religious believer escapes into a consoling, albeit illusory, panacea. On Feuerbach's own, quote, projective theory of the origin of religious belief, predicates that theology traditionally applies to God, such as omnipotence, omniscience, and omnibenevolence, are an anthropomorphistic extension of their limited form in humans. A dissatisfaction with our finite human frame leads the imagination to project a perfected version of these human predicates onto a divine being posited as a transcendent human consciousness. This act of imaginative projection, he claims, is not the result of a deliberation or a conscious mental process, but instead is instinctive and subconscious. Quote, the essence of religion is the immediate, involuntary, unconscious contemplation of the human nature as another, a distinct nature, end quote. As Kemp and Rogers explain, he does not object to the imaginative projection simply as such. The experience of divine revelation, Feuerbach says, is characterized, quote, as a childlike belief, and is only respectable so long as it is childlike, end quote. It's not lamentable in itself. So long as it contains nothing like a, quote, rational articulation of a metaphysical belief grounded in real evidence, but remains a, quote, belief in an object based purely on feeling, such feeling, as Kemp and Rogers note, involves, quote, a yearning to transcend individual limitation, one that thereby contains implicitly, quote, a deep affirmation of the value of humanity, end quote. Feuerbach's main objection to religious belief, thus, is not that faith fails to be rationally justified, but rather, as Kemp and Rogers explain, that the, quote, initially posited separation of God and man, at first involuntary and harmless, now becomes, quote, an intentional excogiated separation, end quote. Quote, the now theologized religion becomes the bringer not of consolation, but of alienation from our true nature, end quote. In a word, belief in God is held to devolve into, quote, an expression not of affirmation of human life, as it was in the initial childlike phase, but of an explicit denial of human life, insofar as it finds itself inadequate compared to the external standard set by the divine being." End quote. The alleged illusory and tranquilizing origin and effect of religious belief can be summarized best by the sentiment the young Nietzsche expresses toward it in the letter to his sister, from which Kemp and Rogers quote, "The illusion of the supernatural has placed the human spirit in a false relationship to the earthly world." End quote. Now, as housekeeping's depiction of Ruth and Lucille's respective forms of denial in response to the grief and loss provoked by the suicide of their mother and drowning death of their father attests, the recurring question at stake in Robinson's fiction thus becomes, is it possible to love life without falsifying it? In reply, one might challenge Feuerbach's description of the religious impulse. The content of the feeling of the divine in Feuerbach is characterized as solipsistic. Quote, "The divine nature, which is discerned by feeling, is in truth nothing else than feeling enraptured in ecstasy with itself, feeling intoxicated with joy, blissful in its own plenitude." End quote. Perhaps, however, Feuerbach has merely distorted the experiential facts. It's not that a transcendent God is a posit resulting from an imaginative projection, but rather that the transcendence of God is revealed immediately in the experience itself, where Feuerbach claims that the, quote, "theologization of the religious impulse is the result of systematic rationation that distorts the originary experience itself, so the same could be said of Feuerbach's own description of it. God is not posited in an imaginative projection, but revealed immediately starting from himself. But be that as it may, in addition, following Jean-Yves Lacoste, here one might also call into question the notion that there is any such thing as one fundamental religious experience or existential attunement. What of, for example, Schleiermacher's feeling of absolute dependence or Dostoevsky's joy? Setting aside for the time being the question of whether religious experience is illusory or not, how can the religious life shaped in its wake affirm this life, this world, and not succumb to the aesthetic ideal's life denial, which in Nietzsche's view is nihilistic? This raises the matter of art and truth. It's in Nietzsche's early philosophical hero, Schopenhauer, as Kemp and Rogers say, that one is, quote, "consumed by the thought that existence was a torment and needed a vision, however imaginary, of a life worth living," end quote. That, quote, "existence is finite, fundamentally unpleasant to us, and has no purpose," end quote, and hence that it's in virtue of beauty, and particularly in aesthetic experience, that life's suffering is rendered tolerable. Schopenhauer's suggestion that the aestheticization of reality is necessary in order to endure what would otherwise be the unbearable meaningless of life's suffering runs entirely contrary to the early Nietzsche's impulse to follow the truth wherever it leads. As Nietzsche's thought develops, however, he himself will abandon, quote, "the will to truth," and contend that there are only competing interpretations of reality, in which case the best image of the world to affirm is whatever one enhances the will to power. For this reason, as Kemp and Rogers observe, quote, "Nietzsche tended to place his hopes for cultural renewal in art. Art, insofar as it develops fictions and illusions, has a more complicated but less aesthetic relationship to the search for truth," end quote. The Nietzschean, quote, "love of fate," though, cannot be willed straightforwardly, for we, quote, "cannot simply decide on a whim to say yes to life. We, quote, "need first to render it beautiful," end quote. Meaning an aesthetic effort is necessary. A crucial passage from Kemp and Rogers summarizing Nietzsche's critical appraisal of the relation among beauty, life affirmation, and Christianity is worth quoting at length. Quote, "Nietzsche's objection to Christianity is that it takes an ambivalent world capable of aesthetic transformation and makes it look ugly instead of beautiful, the Christian decision to find the world ugly and bad. This is at once a claim about Christianity and about the power of human perception. Our decisions about how to view the world are not neutral, but change the character of what we perceive. It leaves open the possibility that we could make the world beautiful and good in part by being committed to perceiving it in a different way. But that is hardly a decision that can be made on a whim. It involves orienting one's whole life toward it, and there's a great deal of residual aestheticism in our inner lives that fights against it." End quote. Nietzsche's objection to Christianity, therefore, is twofold, as is evident in the letter to his sister already mentioned. Quote, "Here the ways of men divide. If you wish to strive for peace of soul and happiness, then believe. If you wish to be a disciple of truth, then inquire." End quote. Christian belief, in short, is said to be false, founded on an illusion, and furthermore, a particularly pernicious one at that, insofar as it's a fantasy that involves denigrating the beauty of this life and this world in favor of the empty compensation of a hope for a better life to come in a supersensible world. Thus, its aims is reverence for this world, this life, and his joy for them, by which Robinson attempts to answer the Nietzschean objection to faith. Consequently, as Kemp and Rogers say, if Robinson's fiction proves successful on its own terms, the result would be not, quote, just that Nietzsche wouldn't object very strenuously to Ames, but might actually respect him, end quote. Moreover, if an assessment of Ames's life demonstrates that he does indeed live up to his words, that insofar as his faith, quote, draws him back into life rather than facilitating flight from it, he thereby represents a Christian character, quote, deserving of Nietzschean respect, end quote. Such is the strategy of Robinson's literary vision, her hymn to creation, as it were. The key to Robinson's producing a portrait of Christian existence that compellingly answers Feuerbach and Nietzsche consists in its conveying not only a vision worthy of our esteem, but one that is convincing. The matter of truth, thus, cannot be discounted, however important considerations of beauty may be. Here, Anthony Rudd's study of painting, Painting in Presence, Why Paintings Matter, which articulates a notion of, quote, presence, explaining a painting's value, brings into view how aesthetic perception discloses the requisite kind of truth essential to Robinson's literary vision. Quote, "Painting matters," says Rudd, "because it is or can be truthful. That, apart from all the many particular reasons why we might value some particular paintings, good paintings in general are of value because they disclose essential aspects of reality," end quote. According to Rudd, good paintings, at least, make available to us a kind of truth that's, quote, non-discursive, which is to say, one that, quote, cannot be adequately paraphrased in non-visual medium. Knowledge of such truth is, therefore, a kind of knowledge by acquaintance, end quote. His notion of presence is meant to highlight the form of non-discursive manifestation he wishes us to notice. Quote, "The term presence indicates a particularly intense or charged way in which we can experience artworks as communicating with us. Paintings make themselves present to us, but in so doing they also make something else, their subject matter, present to us in a way that discursive representations cannot," end quote. To illuminate what he wishes us to see, Rudd underscores a feature of iconography that he maintains holds true of all good painting. Quote, "The icon is exemplary for painting in general, not only in a weak sense, but also in a stronger sense, that what all painting discloses is, in a sense, something sacred, and that painting itself, therefore, is a sacred, even a quasi-sacramental act," end quote. The reason why paintings matter, thus, is that they disclose reality in a fashion that renders the beauty and goodness of nature itself manifest, which in turn explains why, to quote, "experience nature aesthetically is to experience it as being valuable, as having ontological goodness," end quote. A good painting attunes us to this presence that we overlook in quotient perception, insofar as the latter has become habituated to ignore the beauty of things, focusing instead, as it does, on their practical utility and expediency, their readiness to hand, as Heidegger would put it. Contrary, thus, to what a Platonic criticism of art would consider painting to be, as just a matter of mimesis whereby it copies appearances and is hence, quote, not only trivial, but corrupting, end quote. Good paintings, in fact, matter because they disclose ontological truth, the inherent beauty and so value of what they display. Of course, the question naturally arises. If this sort of presence manifest in painting amounts to a kind of truth that is non-discursive and not paraphrasable, what then is to be said of the other arts, above all, literature? Would not literature consequently be incapable of disclosing such truth insofar as its very medium is the written word? Rudd's response to this concern sheds direct light on how Robinson's own literary vision is capable of conveying the kind of truth essential to answering Feuerbach's and Nietzsche's critique of the religious life. He says, quote, "It should, however, be noted that although the knowledge that literature may give us is obviously presented verbally, there's good reason to think that the wisdom conveyed by a great novel is itself not paraphrasable, not reducible to a philosophical summary of ethical truths, say. You cannot adequately represent what Middlemarch or the Brothers Karamazov has to say in a list of general propositions," end quote. And what's true of Middlemarch or the Brothers Karamazov is surely true of Robinson's novels also. That her literary vision brings to presence a kind of truth that cannot be sufficiently paraphrased is precisely why, in order to understand what her fiction gives to see, it's necessary to read Gilead or Home or whatever, rather than merely to read a summary on Cliff Notes or to listen to a podcast discussion of it. There's no substitute for a direct acquaintance with what the work itself discloses. Kevin Rogers are themselves onto the connection between aesthetic experience and the truth at stake in Rudd's own notion of presence, as well as how the aesthetic insight that receives such truth can serve as a model for Ames's own Christian vision of the world and of others more generally. They turn to Karl Ove Knausgaard's book, So Much Longing in So Little Space, on the life and work of painter Edvard Munch for an example, in which Knausgaard reflects on Munch's Cabbage Field from 1915. When reflecting on the effect of an encounter with the painting conjures, one charged with a profound sense of, quote, emptiness and, quote, death, Knausgaard notes, quote, "Sometimes it's impossible to say why and how a work of art achieves its effect," end quote. As Knausgaard himself underscores, this experience before the painting involves more than the sum of the painting's visible properties. What he witnesses in it, in effect, is what Rudd had termed the painting's presence. But if Knausgaard indeed sees, quote, death and, quote, emptiness when beholding Cabbage Field, how is it possible if Munch in it gives form to nothing but cabbages, grain, trees, and sky? The answer is that it doesn't just present colors and forms. It reveals a non-discursive, non-paraphrasable kind of truth, the, quote, death and, quote, emptiness of the landscape's mood, knowledge of which comes only by having a direct acquaintance with it. Knausgaard, as Kemp and Rogers accordingly note, quote, puts his finger on an attribute of paintings that human beings seem to share. If asked to say what Cabbage Field is about, it would be missing the point to merely rattle off a list of its properties: cabbages and wheat, mountains and trees, yellow and green. These details may begin to give sense of what the painting is like, but they no more capture its essence than hair color does a person's soul, end quote. The aesthetic experience in which a painting's presence makes manifest a deep truth that is irreducible to any paraphrase or list of its properties, they observe in turn, can be extended to include a form of, quote, aesthetic insight, by which the depth of the world's things, and above all, the depth of another human being's personality, or, quote, soul, becomes perceptible. This is what Kemp and Rogers suggest is true of Jax Della Miles's perception of her husband. Della, perhaps, they write, quote, has something like this relationship in mind when she imagines what it means to come into contact with a person's soul. On this analogy, Christian vision is tantamount to aesthetic insight, end quote. This insight runs throughout all of Robinson's fiction, not just Jack. As they note, quote, "While nowhere in Robinson's fiction is a person's soul likened to the subject of a painting, in Gilead, Ames offers a comparison that makes the point that, quote, appreciating the earthly qualities of a person's life is a necessary part of a loving soul," end quote. Indeed, in Robinson's view, perceiving the neighbor in his particularity, and here Della's perception of Jack in his singularity is a case in point, unveils a, quote, new indescribable beauty in the other, what Della herself calls, just as Rudd himself has as well, quote, a glorious presence.